The humid Georgia air hung heavy, thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and cheap cologne. Arthur Vance, Art, to those who'd shared a trench with him, felt the familiar prickle of sweat beneath the collar of his worn denim jacket. He hadn't worn a tie in years, not since his wife's funeral, and he wasn't about to start now for a park dedication. But the crisp, almost clinical voice of the young man in the rented security uniform sliced through the buzzing chatter of the crowd, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Sir, this section is reserved. I'm going to need to see your credentials." Art didn't flinch. His gaze, steady and a little weary from 80-odd years of living, settled on the badge pinned to the man's chest, a cheap plastic rectangle. This wasn't the kind of authority he recognized. He held up a crumpled invitation, its embossed lettering smudged from being carried in his pocket for weeks. "I'm here for Private First Class Jenkins." "Samuel Jenkins. This is his park, ain't it?" The security guard, a beefy kid with a jawline too sharp for his 20-something years, barely glanced at the paper. His eyes, cold and dismissive, swept over Art's faded jacket, his scuffed boots, the way his shoulders slumped just a fraction. "Look, old-timer, everyone's here for the Jenkins Park dedication. But this area is for invited guests. People with proper attire." He gestured vaguely at the sea of crisp linen suits and brightly colored dresses. "If you'd like to join the general public, there's plenty of space beyond the ropes." A low murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered near the velvet ropes. Heads turned. Whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, began to spread. "Who's that old man? Why's he in the VIP section? Looks like he just stumbled in from a fishing trip." Art heard them, felt the familiar sting of judgment, a sensation he'd grown accustomed to since coming home from a war few understood. He'd seen worse, much worse, but the casual disdain still chafed. "I was invited," Art stated, his voice a low rasp, but firm. "By the Jenkins family. Sam's family." He clutched the faded invitation tighter. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a promise, a sacred duty. He'd promised Sam, decades ago, lying in the red dust of a forgotten firebase, that he'd never forget. And he hadn't. The second guard, a woman with a severe ponytail and a walkie-talkie pressed to her ear, stepped forward. "Sir, we understand your sentiment, but we have a strict guest list. Your name isn't on it." Her tone was polite, almost rehearsed, but carried an underlying steel. "We'd appreciate it if you could comply." Art looked around the newly manicured park. The freshly painted benches gleamed, the playground equipment sparkled under the morning sun. A large bronze plaque, still covered by a white sheet, stood near the podium. "Sergeant Samuel Jenkins Memorial Park, Sergeant." They promoted Sam posthumously. Art remembered him as a private first class, a scared kid from Alabama with a laugh too big for his skinny frame who died clutching a tattered letter from his mother. He thought of the countless nights he'd spent awake, the phantom screams, the smell of cordite and blood. He thought of the faces he'd seen, the wounds he'd patched, the lives he'd tried to save. Some he had. Sam wasn't one of them. And now, these kids in their clean uniforms talking about guest lists and proper attire. "I'm not moving," Art said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble that seemed to swallow the polite chatter around them. The casual bystanders suddenly went silent. The air crackled. This wasn't a request anymore. This was a stand. The first guard's hand went to his belt where a set of handcuffs glinted. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escort you out." Art's eyes, etched with decades of unspeakable sights, held the guard's gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't even breathe shallow. He had faced down far greater threats than 2 rent-a-cops. His mind drifted to a different kind of silence, the terrifying stillness that descended before an ambush, the quiet prayer whispered over a dying man. This was just noise. Then it happened. Not a shout, not a sudden movement, but a ripple. A slow, deliberate shifting in the crowd. First, from the back rows, then from the edges of the general admission area. They weren't in uniform. Most were older, some with graying hair, others with the telltale limp of old injuries. They wore simple clothes, worn jeans, plain shirts, caps pulled low. But their eyes held the same knowing, quiet intensity that Art recognized in himself. One man, his face a roadmap of scars, stepped forward from the bleachers. Then another, a woman with a faded tattoo of an eagle on her forearm, moved from behind a family pushing a stroller. A third, a burly man with a prosthetic leg, emerged from beside a concession stand. They didn't speak. They didn't even acknowledge each other. They simply moved with an unspoken, almost instinctual precision, converging. They were his ghosts. The ones he'd pulled from burning Humvees, the ones he'd patched up under enemy fire, the ones whose hands he'd held while waiting for medevac. The ones who carried pieces of shrapnel and memories that would never fade. The ones who owed him their lives, or at least, the chance at one. Corporal Miller, whose leg Art had tourniquet with his own belt while the world exploded around them. Sergeant Ramirez, whom Art had revived with CPR, spitting dust and blood after a mortar hit. Private Chin, whose shattered arm Art had splinted with a rifle barrel, talking him through the pain, promising him he'd see his family again. 10 of them. Maybe more. They formed a silent, unyielding semicircle behind Art, a wall of quiet, weathered strength. No weapons. No uniforms. Just their presence. The security guards froze, their faces paling. The walkie-talkie squawked, but the woman didn't answer. She just stared at the silent, unblinking eyes of the veterans. The air, already thick, became almost suffocating with unspoken history. Art looked at the first guard, his voice still a low rumble. "You still need me to move?" The guard swallowed, his hand dropping from his belt. He shook his head, a barely perceptible movement. The woman lowered her radio, her eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. The crowd, which had been buzzing with whispers, now held its breath. Every camera lens, every curious glance was fixed on the old man and his silent, formidable escort. Then, the principal of the local high school, a nervous-looking man in a too-tight suit, stepped to the podium. His voice, amplified by the PA system, crackled with forced cheerfulness. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining us today for the dedication of this beautiful new park, a testament to our community's spirit and a tribute to a true American hero." He paused, cleared his throat. "And now it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a young man who embodies the very best of our future, a scholar, an athlete, and an aspiring military leader. Mr. Noah Vance." The crowd erupted in polite applause. But it was a different kind of clapping that followed, a deep, rhythmic beat that resonated through the ground. The 10 veterans behind Art began to clap, slow, deliberate, powerful. It wasn't an applause, it was a drumbeat, a cadence of honor. Each clap was a hammer blow driving home a truth. The rest of the crowd, initially confused, instinctively fell into the rhythm, their scattered applause coalescing into a unified, thunderous beat. And then he appeared. Noah, Art's grandson. Tall, lean, in his crisp ROTC uniform, medals glinting on his chest. His posture was perfect, his stride confident. He moved with the quiet discipline Art had taught him, the lessons of duty and sacrifice woven into his very being. Noah walked to the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd, past the dignitaries, past the rows of eager faces. His gaze, sharp and intelligent, found Art in the front row, still seated, his expression unreadable, surrounded by the silent, watchful veterans. A flicker of surprise, then understanding, crossed Noah's face. He knew these men, not personally, but through the stories Art had told him late at night, the names whispered like prayers. He'd seen the faded photographs, heard the echoes of distant battles. He paused just for a heartbeat, his eyes locking with Art's. In that moment, the entire park faded away. There was only the old man, the young man, and the unspoken legacy passing between them. Noah reached the podium, shook the principal's hand, and turned to the microphone. The rhythmic clapping continued, a powerful, unwavering heartbeat. "Good morning," Noah began, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the last echoes of the applause. "We are here today to dedicate this park to a hero, Private First Class Samuel Jenkins. But we are also here to remember something more. We are here to remember the quiet heroes. The ones who don't seek recognition, who carry their burdens in silence, who live lives of service long after the uniform comes off." His eyes, full of a fierce, youthful conviction, swept over the crowd, then settled back on Art. "My grandfather, Arthur Vance, taught me that true strength isn't about how loud you shout, but how steady you stand. He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to be moved when the world tries to push you aside." A profound stillness settled over the park. The security guards, now looking deeply uncomfortable, shifted on their feet. The politician, who had been preening for the cameras, suddenly looked down at his shoes. Noah's voice, imbued with a raw, undeniable truth, continued. "He never spoke much of his time in Vietnam, but he showed me. He showed me through every quiet act of kindness, every unwavering principle, every time he stood firm when it would have been easier to walk away." Noah paused, his gaze fixed on Art. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unpinned the ROTC medal from his own uniform. He held it up, the polished silver glinting in the sun. "This medal represents promise, potential. But it is built on the foundation of real sacrifice. Of men like Sam Jenkins. And men like my grandfather." He stepped away from the podium, walked down the 3 steps, and approached Art. The rhythmic clapping from the veterans continued, a deep, resonant hum. Noah stopped in front of Art, who remained seated, his face unreadable. Then Noah bent at the waist, a deep, respectful bow, not to the crowd, not to the principal, but to the old man in the worn denim jacket. As he straightened, he extended his hand, the metal resting in his palm. "Grandpa," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is for you. For standing." Art's eyes, usually guarded, softened. He reached out, his gnarled fingers closing around the metal. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The connection, the understanding, the shared legacy, hung in the air, a palpable force. The crowd, many with tears in their eyes, erupted in a spontaneous, heartfelt cheer. Not the polite applause of earlier, but a raw, emotional outpouring of respect. The security guards stood frozen, forgotten. The politician looked utterly bewildered. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the park slowly emptied. Families dispersed, laughter and chatter fading into the distance. Art remained, seated on a newly installed bench, the bronze plaque of Sam Jenkins Park now fully revealed, catching the last rays of sunlight. Noah sat beside him, the graduation robe folded neatly on the bench between them. "You didn't have to do that, son," Art said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the evening breeze. He turned the medal over in his hand, feeling the cool metal against his palm. Noah leaned back, looking up at the ancient oak tree that framed the park. "Yes, I did, Grandpa. More than you know." He paused, then continued, his voice thoughtful. "That speech, it was supposed to be about Sam. About what he represented. But when I saw those guards and then I saw them." He gestured subtly to where the 10 veterans had stood, now long gone, melted back into the shadows of their private lives. "I knew it wasn't just about Sam anymore. It was about you. About all of you." Art grunted, a sound that could have been agreement or discomfort. He still wasn't one for sentiment. "I used to wonder," Noah confessed, "why you never talked about the war. Why you never wore your medals. Why you always seemed apart." He turned to Art, his eyes earnest. "Today, I think I finally understood. It wasn't because you forgot. It was because you remembered too much." Art looked at the medal in his hand, then back at Noah. "Some things," he said, his voice raspy, "ain't for talking. They're for carrying." A comfortable silence settled between them. The cicadas began their nightly chorus, a low, pulsing hum that filled the air. Art closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of unspoken memories, usually a heavy cloak, felt a little less suffocating. Just then, a beat-up pickup truck rumbled into the almost empty parking lot. It pulled up beside them, and the burly man with the prosthetic leg, the one who'd stood directly behind Art, got out. He walked towards them, a small, hand-carved wooden box clutched in his large hands. "Art," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "Heard Noah's speech. Good kid. Real good." He nodded at Noah, who offered a polite smile. We wanted to give you something." He held out the box. It was crafted from dark, aged wood, simple and unadorned. Art took it, his brow furrowed. He opened it slowly. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were dozens of small, folded pieces of paper. Letters. Not official documents, but handwritten notes, some neatly penned, others scrawled, many tear-stained. He picked one up. Asterisk, "Thank you" document. "You saved my life. My kids wouldn't be here without you." Asterisk another, asterisk, "Art, my brother told me about you. He said you were the last thing he saw. He said you tried. Thank you." Asterisk, he recognized some of the names. Men he'd treated. Families he'd never met. The weight of them, the quiet gratitude, hit him like a physical blow. He looked up at the man from the truck, his eyes glistening. What is this?" "Letters," the man said, his voice softer now. "From the guys you saved. From their families. We've been collecting them for years. Wanted you to know you weren't forgotten. Not by us." He paused, then added, "And there's one more." He pointed to a small, worn dog tag at the bottom of the box, nestled amongst the letters. It was Sam Jenkins's. Art picked it up, his thumb tracing the etched letters. PFC Samuel Jenkins. He'd thought it was lost forever. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to see it again. The man from the truck nodded. "Mission complete, Art." He turned and limped back to his truck, leaving Art and Noah in the quiet twilight. Art closed the box, holding it tight. The weight in his hands was not just wood and paper, but decades of lives, of unspoken thanks, of a legacy he hadn't known he carried. He looked at Noah, who watched him with a silent understanding. "They didn't save my life today, Grandpa," Noah said, his voice barely a whisper. "They showed me what it means to live one." Art nodded, a single, slow nod. He reached out and placed the wooden box on Noah's lap. "Now carry it well, son." Noah looked down at the box, then back at his grandfather, a new depth in his young eyes. He understood. This wasn't just a park. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was a passing of the torch. Not of rank or medals, but of an unwavering spirit, a quiet strength that endured, passed from one generation of service to the next. The true meaning, he realized, had just begun to set.